Namaste and welcome to yet another webinar on COVID. Friends, we have witnessed many pandemics in the past with huge losses, but this is unprecedented, never seen before. It is playing havoc with our lives in more than one ways. We are not only losing lives, economical loss, industry is under shutdown, there are huge losses in the jobs, there are pay cuts, there are socio-economic problems, and industries under shutdown. There are labor migration problem, psychological issues. Today, what we expect you to do with our team of experts, we will try to untangle a lot of myths which are associated with coronavirus. I am Dr. Deep Goyal, your host and moderator for today. I am a consultant robotic and minimal access surgeon at the Department of GI Oncosurgery in BLK Super Specialty Hospital. Now I will take the opportunity to introduce my esteemed panelists to you one by one. First of all, Dr. Raman Goyal, who is a very prolific minimal access surgeon, bariatric surgeon at Wockhardt Hospital, Mumbai. He is also currently the president of Indian Association of Gastroendosurgeons. And in these difficult times, through association, he's doing a wonderful job in terms of spreading awareness through webinars and also looking after the frontline warrior by donating and contributing to them through PPEs. Welcome, Dr. Raman. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Sandeep Buddhiraja, who is an internist. He is also Group Medical Director at Max chain of hospitals. He's not only an internist, but also somebody involved in policy making, especially in these difficult times. Thank you very much, Sandeep, for joining us.
Thank you.
Next is Professor Kavi Arya. He is a professor of robotics and computer science in IIT Mumbai, and he's very actively involved in technology side against the fight for coronavirus. He's going to enlighten us today what technology is doing and how it is helping us in fight against corona. Welcome, Professor Arya. Then we have Mr. Mehra, who is Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of TPA's Insurance. As all of us know that insurance plays an important role in healthcare delivery, and during these difficult times, they are facing a lot of challenges and he will throw some light on them. Then we have Dr. Chand Watal, who is head of the Department of Clinical Microbiology at Sir Ganga Ram Hospital in New Delhi. He is involved since many decades in research, in academics, and clinical epidemiology. Welcome, Dr. Chand.
Hi, welcome.
Then we have Dr. Neeru. Dr. Neeru is doctor by profession. She's also a psychologist. She is a consultant to many multinational companies about diversity and inclusion. She's also co-founder of Ask Insight. Couple of days back, she was nominated by Election Commission of India as the national icon. Welcome, Dr. Neeru.
Thank you.
Last but not the least, Dr. K.K. Agarwal, whom all of us know. Apart from being a cardiologist of repute, he's been in public health life for many decades. He was also the president of Indian Medical Association, and he's at present chief editor of MedTalks. I think I missed out Zamir, my very close friend. Dr. Zamir Pasha is a very prolific surgeon, minimal access surgeon, one of the few pioneers in this part of the world who started doing laparoscopic surgery. He has been the past president of Indian Association of Gastroendosurgeons, and currently he is the trustee of IAGS. Apart from this, he is also governor of Rotary Club, currently a District 3000 in Kerala, Trichy, and through IAGS and through Rotary, he is involved in a lot of charity work at present. Thank you so much, Zamir, for joining us. Thank you. So, right, has Dr. K.K. Agarwal joined us? Not yet. Okay. So, I am going to skip his first question and come to Sandeep. Sandeep, what are the treatment protocols available at this point of time for patients who are already confirmed to be a corona patient? Are they FDA approved? Are there guidelines from associations? And what kind of results are we seeing? You have to unmute yourself, Sandeep.
Yeah. Okay. So essentially, as we all know that there is no specific cure for COVID-19 as of now, and even the vaccine is under development. So whatever treatment protocols or options are available are basically all trials based on experience with previous antivirals and specifically RNA influenza viruses and how they have worked. The experience comes mainly from three main countries, that's China, South Korea, and US, as to how they have used. So essentially, we first have to understand whether it's a mild disease or a mild with some risk factors, moderate, severe, and critical. Most of the cases of COVID, one needs to understand, would be asymptomatic or mild, and most of them would recover. So the ratios we are looking for is 80% would be mild disease and would recover on their own. About 15% would require hospitalization and 5% would require ICU care. Those who are in the ICU, half of them may require ventilator. And of those who are on ventilator, the numbers are divided. Now, there are statistics which say 50% of patients on ventilator come out. From US, there is a series which says 88% of patients on ventilators do not make it. So that's individual variation. Now, coming to the treatment protocols. So, and this is, I won't be naming various studies, but this is the gist of what the various studies show, that hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin forms the so-called standard of care. All of us know that there are a lot of recent studies about hydroxychloroquine showing response to absolutely no response. The other option for this combination is ritonavir and leponavir, which is an antiviral combination with azithromycin. And this antiviral combination was the first one to be used earlier in the pandemic. But later studies really have put this combination completely at a disuse. So we still have this combination available for those cases where hydroxychloroquine is either contraindicated or cannot be used. Now, this is, of course, I'm talking about mild to moderate or moderate disease, patients who require hospitalization. And most of these would be put on some broad spectrum antibiotic because secondary bacterial infections are very common. Now, coming to certain therapies which have been tried but are not available, or certain experimental therapies which can be tried and are available. Now, two drugs are very important. One is favipiravir. Now, this is an antiviral drug which was produced by Fujifilm in Japan almost a decade back to be used in case of RNA viral pandemics. Never got used, but this time the Japan actually lent it to China to try it, and they had a very favorable response in some cases when used in mild to moderate conditions. Presently not available in India, but Japan has promised to release it to 30 countries, out of which India doesn't have a mention. Then there is, again, a very interesting drug called remdesivir, which I'm sure many of you would have heard about, various trials which are ongoing, some showing very good effectiveness, especially when used in moderate to severe cases, and it has saved lives, saved certain patients or even going on to ventilator, and equal number of studies which have put it at a disrepute. But I would still keep the antennas on for this drug, which is produced by Gilead, are not yet available in India, but there are pharmaceutical companies which are promising to produce both these favipiravir and remdesivir in India. So a time will come when the studies come up and show. The other two categories which we must mention in the experimental therapies is, one is a drug called tocilizumab, which is basically for the cytokine storm, which is a very, very major event in these patients, and ultimately leads to multi-organ failure. So in such a situation where a person is going into a situation of multi-organ failure, tocilizumab as an IL-6 antagonist or a blocker can be used. We have had experience. We have used it in certain patients in ICU. It is available in India. And last but not the least, a mention must be made at this stage about the role of convalescent plasma, which all of you know that is not a new thing for us. It's been used in past, especially in outbreaks where there's no specific treatments available. It has shown promising results. Two important, very small series studies which are there from US. One in 5 ventilated patients, all 5 came out and recovered. Another study, interestingly, used in 10 patients where they saw a significant reduction in viral clearing from 10 days to 4 days. in India, as you know, that plasma therapy has started with some promising results. So we still have to see and await the results of larger trials to see whether this becomes a therapy till a specific antiviral treatment comes in. And before I stop, one very important thing one needs to understand is that it's a very prothrombotic state, and severe thrombosis and coagulation happens, and a lot of people have pulmonary embolism. So appropriate anticoagulation is very important in these cases. Role of steroids is controversial. When there is a fulminant cytokine storm and severe septic shock, which is refractory, in those cases, steroids do have a role. Ventilation is something which one must be very careful about. Prone positioning, high flow nasal cannula actually can prevent a person going on to ventilator. Ventilator should be avoided till as a last resort. Although initial part of pandemic, we heard that we should do early intubation. Now the reports are saying it should be a delayed intubation, and only as a last resort should the patients be put on ventilators. Whereas if you're putting the patient on a high flow nasal cannula or an NIV, please ensure that it is a negative pressure room, because there is too much of aerosolization of the virus. I'll stop here and take any specific questions later on if needed.
Perfect. So then, Dr. Agarwal is not here. I will then move to Dr. Chan Watal at the moment. What, in your opinion, is the most accurate test at present? And what are the false positive and false negative results of them? And what are the implications of this?
Thank you, Deep. Well, we talk of the most accurate diagnostic tests. Whenever we talk of diagnostic tests, we always talk of gold standards. In this case, if you go to the classical purist, gold standard will be the viral cultures, and you know that it cannot be done as of today. But another way of classical purist gold standard will be the viral cultures, and you know that it cannot be done as of today. So very near to it is purist gold standard will be the viral cultures, and you know that it cannot be done as of today. Viral RNA actually can be detected. That is what we do with the RT-PCR. So when the RT-PCR is available and we try and pick up these from the most viremic sites, whether it's the nasopharyngeal followed by throat swab, or maybe the patient, if he is diarrheic, and may have the virus in the stools. So the test that we need to recommend for diagnosis is the RT-PCR, which is being currently done across the country. You talk of the false negatives and false positives. False negatives, yes. We have seen that the the sensitivity of RT-PCR has been somewhere between 69 and 70%. So there have been around 30%, 28 to 30% patients can be missed. And then it also depends at the stage, at what stage of viremia the patient is, because we have had the reports where the earlier sampling was negative and subsequently these patients turned out to be positive. So since many patients don't give the history correctly, and you are not able to actually ascertain at what day of the disease that gentleman is or that patient is, so you try and miss the cases. And you may at that time, if they tell you correctly as to when the symptoms started or when the contact was there, you may try and calculate their 5th or 7th day when they are supposed to be very viremic in the nasopharynx. And then people are also trying to take only throat swabs, but probably I think that's a relatively inferior stuff than the nasopharyngeal swab, which is more diagnostic or gives more yield. Throat swabs have been seen to have more inhibitors than the nasopharyngeal swabs. So that is as far as the false negatives are concerned. But I'm afraid if you talk of false positives, inherent with the PCRs, as we know, they have a level of detection, and the positivity, false positivity, can come up only if you mug up with the disease, with the testing process, because it's a highly sensitive investigation. If you are not careful and if your people are not very well trained, because it's not just like a urine culture or blood culture, it's a very highly exacting process which you need to undergo, and it's in various parts, in 3 parts that it happens. If you are not able to take a right swab, if you are not carrying it in the right temperature, if you are not carrying it in the viral transport media, and how long you take reaching it to the diagnostic laboratory, and then there at various steps, whether you are actually extracting the RNA, or then when you are trying to detect the RNA, you can commit a mistake. And that's where I see the false positivities, where the carryover of the other positive RNAs can be false positives. That's what
Also, I think, Also, I think it's very uncomfortable to take a proper nasopharyngeal swab. So I think a lot of people just go for a throat swab rather than a proper nasopharyngeal swab. That is also another point.
Yeah, there are two things for both throat as well as nasal. In nasal, actually, you run the risk of the guy incessantly sneezing. So that puts at risk other people. And similarly, throat swab, which does initiate cough, but probably it is less of coughing than the amount of sneezing that you can actually initiate. So you need to be very careful where the testing centers are and where the samples are being collected.
Thank you, Dr. Chand Wattal. Welcome, Dr. Agarwal. I have a question for you. As we all know where we are, we have around 26,000 cases at present in our country. And what do you think as compared to other countries where we stand at present?
So there are a couple of things I want to say. Today, we attended a meeting with JP Nadda, where many people were there. And a question was asked, how long government is preparing itself? And they said 1 year. We asked the same questions to WHO. They said 2 years. And when we had a meeting of experts, we said 4 years. That means this process is going to stay. We have to live with it, number one. Number two, what Dr. Chand has spoken is that remember that PCR is only 70% effective.
Yeah, that's what he said.
Have 30% of false negative. Therefore, if you are doing a surgery and if you say, get a PCR test, you say positive, you say, I'm deferring the surgery. And if you say PCR negative, you say, I'm not sure whether you are positive or negative. You say, I'm deferring the surgery. Therefore, in any case, you are deferring the surgery because you are not sure whether it is positive or negative. Therefore, we have to presume every surface is positive and we have to presume that every person is positive and we have to take standard precautions. The lockdown is going to continue and will shift from a street lockdown to your personal lockdown. You have to maintain your personal social distancing. You have to maintain you have to protect yourself, your house, wherever you go. Cycling will come back and the people will start walking and social distancing is going to be a norm for at least 1 year. Now, why India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, why are we behaving differently? Nobody has the answer. Is it BCG? Because our mortality is comparatively lower. Our mortality is much lower. It's not only India. I'm talking about Hindustan, wherever we were combined, our mortality levels are much lower than that of US and that of European countries. Even China, the mortality was very low, and we do have Mongolians in our country where also the mortality is less. So therefore, in two straits, when we talk about Mongolians, and we talk about Aryan, and we talk about Dravidians, the immunity level, the mortality level is very low. And if you go back to SARS and MERS, the same thing happened. It never entered into the Indian continent. I talk about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, it never entered. Spanish flu was different and H1N1 was different. So H1N viruses behave differently. But why this virus is not causing mortality in Asian countries, we have no answer. As on today, we have no answer. It can be, one of the factor can be BCG, but even if you see in Japan, South Korea, everywhere the mortality levels are lower, except for Arabian countries where in Iran, the reason in Iran, when we spoke to Iranian Medical Association, and they gave us a very different answer, which was eye-opening for us. Iran said that they were getting a number of cases, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they started giving everybody on ventilator. Mortality went on increasing, and then they were short of ventilators. And then they started pushing people on oxygen and their mortality reduced. So they said they were overusing ventilators and people were dying because of ventilators. And a new term came, which is called as a walking death. Walking death means that you are having, otherwise you are all right, but you are very, very, very hypoxic. Your lung status, elasticity is normal. These are the people who may not be requiring ventilator. And even if they require a ventilator, it may be for a short period of time. So why Asians are behaving different, I don't know. I talked to Singapore, I talked to Hong Kong, I talked to South Korea yesterday in our meeting, weekly meeting, which we meet, 19 countries we meet every week. One of the reasons they say is, Hong Kong says our healthcare mortality is almost zero. South Korea says that healthcare mortality is almost zero. And the same thing is an experience of Singapore. And they said, we have learned from SARS. So all our hospitals has AII rooms. And South Korea says in 5 days, they made sure that every hospital expanded and they built up AII rooms. That means in the triage, if you are needing any procedure, it will be done in an AII room. I don't know why in India we don't even have AII rooms even for tuberculosis, where it is basically meant for that. And in America, we don't expect, because they don't have TB, AII rooms are not there. Therefore, in America, Western countries, the mortality may be higher. The time in India is that you build up your AII rooms as early as possible. Sandeep may be able to tell whether their hospital has a AII rooms facility or not. And if that is not available, then the best thing is to use air purifier with a CDR of 10 cycles per hour. Still not negative pressure, but at least Jugadu method. And even the up-to-date mentions that those hospitals, to reduce the healthcare worker burden, if you don't have AII rooms, use high-powered air purifiers with a CDR rate of 10 cycles per hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. Thank you very much for such a comprehensive views on this. I have another question for you because you came late. A lot of hue and cry about HCQ. Everybody has an opinion on this. Do we understand as of now whether it works or it does not work, or we are in the same space that give it, what is the harm?
It was 1980 when I was with Dr. Malviya, posted in All India Institute of Medical Sciences in the rheumatology department. And at that time, we were giving SCQS outright to people. People were there for 4 hours, 4 years, 6 years, 2 years. And it was, and that at that particular moment, there was a time when we were seeing that every foreigner who is coming to India is on chloroquine, 2 tablets per week for years together. And then at that time, I had a long discussion with Dr. Khalilullah, and we started mooting the idea that all heart patients, at that time, dengue was not there. It was malaria which was disturbing us. And at that time, we floated that all heart patients should take chloroquine twice, 2 tablets per week. And all the cardiologists' consensus statement was that it is safe. Now, what is unsafe is a combination of chloroquine with azithromycin, not chloroquine again. The fear is of a combination, and that combination is not there in a prophylaxis. I feel if you really want to add an antibiotic with the hydroxychloroquine, you can add doxycycline, which has the same antiviral effect as that of azithromycin. So
my question, Dr. Agarwal, is whether it is working or not.
I'm coming. Whether it works or not has no value, but we know it has some antiviral effect. We know it has an anti-HIV effect. Today, whether it is a placebo, at least it's reassuring me that it may reduce my viral load. I'm putting the word may. Therefore, people like me who are 61 plus are taking it. We are a believer of that it has some antiviral effect, and it has an anti-HIV effect. The people started talking about, when they started talking about this COVID virus also has a similarity to HIV virus. And that was the time when people started working on SCQS.
So what you are essentially saying, Dr. Agarwal, is that people who are at high risk for taking chloroquine should not take it. They should not take it in a combination with other antibiotics, preferably. So otherwise, there's some antiviral effect.
Whether you will be given a combination, that will be decided by your doctor with a shared decision. It is not for the public. When it comes to prophylaxis, azithromycin is not there. 2 tablets per week is absolutely harmless. Very rare situation, you have a congenital QT syndrome. I have never seen in my life. Only few doctors have seen that particular condition. Those people who believe that if they are a healthcare worker, talk to your doctor, and if they say take it, take it. I am taking it.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Agarwal. And I will now move on to next question to Dr. Chand Watal. Sir, what is this antibody test? Who should be tested and when it should be tested? A lot of controversy going around this.
I think we have reached that stage as yet in the hospital care settings. The first disclaimer is that it is not a test for diagnosis. I will repeat, this is
not a test for diagnosis.
As on today. So in hospital-based or critical acute care, antibodies actually test should not be looked at. Now you ask me as to what's going on, what is happening in India, why are we getting it? It is meant for a different reason. We're talking of hotspots. We want to pick up some more cases quickly, and we cannot do RT-PCR for all of them, which is time consuming and very exacting at the same time. But we need to have the hotspot areas where we want to do
Surveillance.
the screening of the contacts and try and pick up patients or people who have IgM positive probably. And those are the ones that you may try and do the quarantine and take them as positives and quarantine. But unfortunately, it has not taken up in India because of various reasons, that the kits were not good or whatever, and they continue to give negatives, and it was recalled by ICMR for 2 days, now 4 days, and now we yet to hear from them. As far as I am concerned, if I at all keep it in my hospital, I may see for only 2 reasons that I may try and do that. And that is a patient coming to you after having had done his RT-PCR, say 10 days back, and he has an ILI type disease, and you may try and do an antibody test because his RT-PCR was negative, and you may try and get into IgM positivity. But if it is negative, you're back to square one. Similarly, if there is a patient who comes repeatedly, say a thalassaemic patient comes repeatedly to you for blood transfusion, and you're worried, is he a carrier or not? So you may try and do an RT-PCR first, put him in that category that doesn't have that, believing that yes, 30% you miss. 10 days later, again, you may follow up with an antibody test to pick up if in case, because they're rapid tests. Similarly, in case you find there are patients who need repeated coming for their procedures like dialysis, like hemato-oncology, or for the chemotherapy, and you are worried and they are having morbid conditions, you may try and, but the first test has to be RT-PCR so that you do not miss these cases right away. My worry is you do an antibody test, it comes negative, you leave that patient back to the community, and he creates another island of this disease. So we have to be very careful, and it's yet to have to understand as to where this test needs to be used. So that's the current status.
Thank you, Dr. Chanwal. That was very, very comprehensive. Now coming to Professor Kavi Arya. Dr. Arya, can you tell us what are the current situation of the apps and how do they help us at this point of time?
Okay, as you know, Dr. Goyal, the main app which is there in the national consciousness at the moment is Arogya Setu, which is pushed very aggressively by the government, by the PMO and everybody. Amitabh Bachchan has endorsed it, and they've got all sorts of videos on it. It's basically an alert system which is based on Bluetooth and GPS. And it's got a self-assessment chatbot, which asks you various leading questions like, do you have any complaints like hypertension, this and that? Have you traveled abroad recently? Have you come into contact with a COVID-19 person? And based on the chat that you have, it designates you either a suspect or not suspect or a COVID-19 person. And then it uses your information to give information to other people who have this app. Like, for instance, through Bluetooth, it can sense when somebody else, it can sense the status of people that you come close to through the Bluetooth signal of their phone. Now, apparently, this kind of app has been built by the Korean government also in South Korea and all that. It's fairly useful. Only problem is that you cannot assume that everybody has this app, because it needs everybody to have this app to be really effective. Apparently, there have been some 7.5 crore downloads, which is about 75 million, which is less than a tenth of the population, if you look at it. So it doesn't give you a total picture. So there might be people that you meet that it will not warn you about. So one other thing is that Google Play Store is at the moment not allowing any non-government endorsed app on the Play Store. We ourselves at IIT Bombay, in my robotics project called eYantra, have built an app like this, but Play Store will not allow us to put it up. So we are in the process of going through government channels. There's something that's needed, which we wanted to give doctors, which we built into our app, is a simple contact logging tool, because doctors apparently have to write on slips of paper who they are meeting on a daily basis. So in case they test positive, they don't have an easy way of informing the authorities who all they've met. So that's Arogya Setu. There are various state government apps like there's a app from Chennai which helps you know which are the quarantine locations and so on. There's an app from Punjab which checks you for symptoms and total count of suspects and confirmed, recovered, and all that kind of stuff. There's a Haryana app, Sahayak, and so on. So various states have their own little apps, but I don't know too much about the status of them. As far as
Most of the apps, what I understand from you is that most of the apps at this point of time are working on information which you feed in, as well as
exactly
GPRS combination.
exactly and GPS
Yeah.
location information.
If you have to change anything in the app, and if you want an ideal app, what will that be? And is that kind of app in pipeline?
There are lots of interesting things. So we have an app that we've called Rakshak. And if you do a search on E-Yantra, which is our project, and Rakshak, you can download it from our website. Particularly useful for doctors because it lets you do contact logging. So if by any chance you test positive, it gives you a list of all the people you've entered in the last 2 weeks, right? Which can help very much to trace
Contact tracing.
the people. Contact tracing. That's not available in the other apps because they depend too much on technology, and you can't assume that everybody has got a smartphone. Then they have multilingual support. They have dashboards which pick up information from the net as to the status of the corona in your city and other states and this, that, and the other. These are mainly the things. There's a need for e-token for shopping, like you must be going to Star Bazaar and various supermarkets, right? There's a need for tokenizing the queues because you don't want to stand in these long queues. So there's something that apps can do there. But I think basically this tracking with GPS and Bluetooth type of technology is the most useful thing. And as we go along and we experience more and more problems with as an outcome of the virus, we'll be discovering more and more utilities which we'll be building into these apps.
We are actually into early phase of knowing the virus.
Too early, yes.
Thank you, Professor Arya. So I will now ask a question to Mr. S.K. Mehra from TPS. Sir, does any existing insurance policy cover COVID infection? And what are the percentage of people who are claiming insurance for COVID disease at present?
Every insurance policy covers the COVID-19. Presently in India, every health insurance policy covers COVID-19. Initially, there were some doubts, as our other policies don't cover pandemic, epidemic. But this policy, health insurance, covers everything. There is no exclusion of this kind. And initially, there were some doubts in the people, but then even the regulator clarified that we have to entertain these claims and they are to be treated as a normal claim and normal hospitalization claims will be treated. So there is no exclusion of this kind. Some of the insurers are coming with different COVID-19 policies. Some insurers have come. There are small ticket also, and some fixed benefit policies are also coming. So, as it is, I would suggest that it is better to have a normal health insurance policy because that covers other diseases also in addition to this. So there are some policies coming specifically COVID-19. They can be taken as a top-up only. Otherwise, all our...
And are you seeing a lot of claims being generated for the COVID disease at present?
As far as my experience goes, our company, so based on that, I can say around 2 to 2.5% of the claims reported in COVID is covered by insurance companies.
Thank you, Professor Mehra. Thank you, Dr. Mehra. So that you have already answered this question that, there are a lot of policy now specifically covering COVID, and they are, ranging from small ticket to large ticket. So coming to Dr. Neeru. Dr. Neeru, as you know that all illnesses and these kind of illnesses, pandemics, where there are so many socio-psychological problems, isolation, and do you, in your practice now, seeing that interpersonal relationship in the family and with the colleagues and with everybody else is getting affected, and in what way?
Yeah, so Deep, both me and my team, we are doing counseling sessions for people from morning to evening ever since lockdown started.
Right.
And we are observing two kind of trends which are running parallelly. On one hand, there are families where the relationships are actually improving. They're now getting the time with each other that they never got earlier. And they're enjoying that. Of course, even within that, there are tiffs and disagreements, but those families have resilience and they're able to bounce back much faster. And then there is the other category where it is going down badly, and the domestic violence, in fact, in many countries are now reporting an increase in domestic violence. There is anxiety attacks. There is even people are on the verge of clinical depression. But what we are seeing is that category of people are ones who already had a strained relationships, but they were somehow, due to the busy work style, it was just standing there together because the days were just going by. And now that they're spending so much time with each other, everything is surfacing up together, and it's difficult then to put it under the carpet. But in my viewpoint, even that is not bad, because it is bringing to their attention, and there's decision making happening there which otherwise needed attention. So it's actually a very big reminder for all of us that in our busy schedules we forget about relationships, and when crisis comes, they're the first thing that we have to handle. Then there is another thing that I'm seeing, because I coach a lot of corporate clients. There we are seeing that the gender stereotypical roles of women taking care of the household chores are coming right back. So let's say there's a corporate couple where both are going for work, nobody is doing the household chores, there's domestic help. Now there's no domestic help, and once again it's falling on the women. Child care, household chores, elderly care is falling on the women. And when they have to cope with all the meetings, online meetings, and the corporate work together, I'm seeing it's having a very big toll on them. Not all. There are families where the men are pitching in very nicely, but there are still, in our country especially.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that, Neeru.
Yeah.
So I think that's the beauty of your profession, that you are still able to see a lot of positivity out of such a gloomy picture. But yeah, that's very heartening to know that a huge percentage of people who are spending more time with their family are able to bond better. That's a very heartening. And also I think it will remind us what is more important in our lives in times to come. And taking from here, so do you think these relationship changes only because of lockdown, the negative part of the changes in the relationship which are happening, or it is multifactorial?
It is multifactorial. See, let's acknowledge that the fear and threat of the illness is there in all of us. Whether we talk about it, whether we think about it or we don't, these stress hormones, the fear brings about all the fight, flight, and freeze response, and the threat hormones of cortisol and adrenaline are already higher than baseline. And then when they are activated by other things like relationships, like marital disharmony, like financial difficulties, like an underlying disease, then this becomes even more aggravated, and then the spiral goes down tremendously. And who knows, after all this is over, we might have to deal with the mental illness part of it much more than the physical illness part of it. That's going to be an equally strong area to be looked into.
Also because of the insecurity of the job, that also, maybe contributing. People are sitting at home, job losses.
I'm having people who say that I get up at the middle of the night at 2:00 and I start sending emails.
Absolutely.
Because I'm really worried for my job, that what if I'm not needed tomorrow? So that's bordering mental illness anyway. Yeah.
Thank you, Neeru. Thank you so much. So this is a picture I picked up from the net. This is a couple who both are nurses, I think in Spain. And, they both are working as a frontline warriors in COVID positive hospitals. And they don't get time to see each other at home because they are sometimes under quarantine or different duty hours. And they can't hug each other without the PPEs. So it's very heartening to see how they are interacting. And this is in fact going to be reality very soon. Coming back to you, Professor Arya, does artificial intelligence has any role? Data analytics, artificial intelligence. We didn't talk about that. We only talked about Bluetooth, GPS.
So this has got many facets. You'll have to give me a little bit of time for this because as you know, right, everybody is obsessed by AI and they feel that AI is going to displace everybody and the whole marketplaces and healthcare and engineering and manufacturing is going to change. So I have various categories in which I'd like to discuss this. First of all, diagnostic AI. I'll just highlight, just to give you an example, that AI has improved diagnostic time through technology like that developed by a company called Linking Med, a Beijing-based oncology data platform, and it's a medical data analysis company. What it does is that since pneumonia is an indicator of or a common complication of the COVID-19 infection, it can diagnose pneumonia, right, by analysis of a CT scan in less than 60 seconds with accuracy as high as 92% and a
Right.
recall rate of 97% on test data sets. And this was made possible by open source AI models that analyze all these CT images and all that. So this platform, incidentally, in China was powered by Baidu's open source deep learning platform. So this is just one instance of how AI and technology can help in the diagnostic space. Then there's the area of early warning and alerts, right? So these are AI softwares that trawl the net. They trawl Google searches, they trawl Twitter feeds, they trawl data sources, right? Millions and millions, billions of data sources to try and predict that there's a virus hit which is going to happen. So there's a tool, for instance, called, there's an AI model called Blue Dot from a Canadian-based startup by a guy called Kamran Khan, which can outpredict humans in spotting infectious disease outbreaks. So, for instance, Blue Dot predicted the outbreak of this infection on the 31st of December last year, before the World Health Organization did that on the 9th of January of this year. Okay. And the researchers working with Blue Dot also published a notice in the Journal of Travel Medicine on the 14th of Jan of this year, where it also listed the top 20 destination cities where passengers from Wuhan would arrive. Flight itineraries also to see how a disease can spread from a particular place, right? So it can give you all this kind of warning. And there are some other systems which are also like this. But let us not undervalue the role of human scientists, because these predictions are also helped by humans. They can also kind of give various scenarios to humans, and humans can estimate, and then they'll take an average of all the estimates and put that out as kind of an alert, right? So human beings are also required in this space. The other thing would be tracking and prediction, right? How to predict how COVID-19 will spread over time and space, right? Like they did this with the Zika virus and all that. And there's various work in Carnegie Mellon University where they had algorithms trained to predict seasonal flu, for instance. But now they have to retrain it with the new data from COVID-19. Now, the problem with doing a prediction of this kind is that you have to have many years of data and then you can predict. Since COVID-19 is new, it will take some time for these models to actually stabilize because they don't have enough historical data. Again, these guys are harvesting big data from social media and all these kind of things.
Right.
As you know, social media, there's lots of noise nowadays. There's lots of hype and there's lots of anxiety and fear. So it kind of plays up. Then last few things are kind of data dashboards, which you've been seeing in various newspapers, New York Times, John Hopkins has its own, and Microsoft Bing's AI tracker. So which are just presenting data to you in various intelligent ways. They have a bit of AI there. And just a couple of things at the end is they're using it in epidemiology and kind of predicting the molecule shape and all that kind of stuff. But from my side, from AI in robotics and all that, they use facial recognition and fever detection, right, with AI algorithms to spot people in airports in spite of masks, right, seeing whether they might be infected. And then I've been hearing a lot about drones being used for flying across a population and spotting who might be having a fever and all these type of things. And then robots are being used to deliver food and medication and for sterilizing isolation wards and all these kind of stuff.
So what you're saying, as I understand, Professor Arya, is that technology, artificial intelligence, data science all have a huge role to play, but they are not going to undermine the role of humans. And also it is up to the humans to take out this interpretation and apply it to practice.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Thank you very much for lovely insight.
Okay.
So, Dr. K.K. Agarwal, I'm going to ask you a very specific question. My brother-in-law is a cardiologist in UK, and I was talking to him. What he said, very interesting, that if a patient is coming with the cardiac symptoms and angiography tells them that this patient requires a coronary artery bypass, nobody in UK at this point of time is doing coronary artery bypass. They have been asked to stent these patients. Is that correct? And do you think that kind of changes we are seeing in our practice in our country here?
Let me tell you three situations. Situation number one is a patient. First of all, is our principle used to be that failure of adequate lifestyle and medical treatment to provide wanted quality of life is an indication for an intervention, and that period is coming back. 1. 2, 30 out of 100 patients with coronary artery disease, 30 will need medical treatment, 30 will need an intervention, and 30 is plus minus. Those plus minus used to end up into intervention. Now they are ending up with a medical and a lifestyle treatment. So the people who really need a surgery or an angioplasty, there was a time in 1984 which was used to be called them as a thrombolytic era. Then came PCI, then said every patient should go into PCI. And now we are going back that if you have RCA lesion, if you have inferior wall MI, if you have a lateral wall MI, if you have a stable patient, if your hemodynamics is normal, give them thrombolysis and then watch. And then you can do angiography later. That time is coming back now. Now, when it comes to cardiogenic shock, acute left main disorder, and angioplasty is not available, then surgery has to be done. So we are going back to conservative interventional cardiology and a bypass surgery, where it's a question of a life and death, you do it. And I normally say another सूत्र I says कि अपना नालायक लड़का गोद लिए हुए लायक लड़के से तब तक अच्छा है जब तक जान का दुश्मन ना बन जाए. So therefore, if it's a question of life and death, go ahead with PCI or surgery. If you feel that I have a choice, then go ahead with the medical treatment or go ahead with the angioplasty.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sandeep, a question to you. There is some noise about people who are on anti-hypertensive medicine, especially ACE inhibitors. They probably are more prone for coronavirus. Is that true?
So this report, I remember, came very early when the outbreak was only limited to Wuhan.
Right.
And there was this editorial which said that people who are on ACE inhibitors, especially the elderly ones, are the ones who are dying more. And so at that time, it was a discussion between whether hypertension is a risk factor or people who are on ACE inhibitors for hypertension is a risk factor. And soon, within days, a big consensus statement came from ACC, AHA, saying that ACE inhibitors do not increase mortality. In fact, if at all, inhibitors could be protective in these patients. Over the last 2-3 months, the way the overall consensus is emerging is that all those patients, hypertensives, who are well controlled on ACE, there is no need to change the ACE inhibitors.
No need to change.
If there's a new prescription for hypertension which is to be given, so as a newly diagnosed hypertensive, then you may not give them ACE inhibitors and give them maybe calcium channel blockers. So that's where we stand. The whole discussion actually started from the fact that this virus attaches to these receptors, ACE receptors on the cells, and how that can then ACE inhibitors modulate or facilitate or prevent the entry into the cell. So the consensus right now is those on ACE inhibitors continue. For new prescriptions, don't use ACE inhibitors.
Perfect. Very clear. Thank you very much. Coming to Dr. Raman Goel. Sir, we know that at some point of time, we have to come out of the lockdown. What kind of scenario you foresee, especially for clinicians, how we are going to conduct ourselves in the hospitals?
So I think Deep, lockdown has to, and lockdown is just delaying the peak and giving the governments time to prepare the hospitals to take care of the large load of patients which are going to come, because virus is not going to go away. It's going to affect at least 50 to 60% of our population at some stage. So how does healthcare manage the virus? I think that applies even today. We need to learn to maintain social distancing, maintain hand hygiene, use protective equipment, right from a family physician level to a tertiary care hospital. And considering that every patient is potentially COVID positive. So this clamor to have a test before a surgery or before a procedure is actually not justified because it's not necessary. At the end, yesterday, the Maharashtra task force came out with guidelines on whom you should test. If somebody comes positive, how do you manage yourself if somebody comes positive after a procedure or after surgery? So I think the clarity is coming now. As far as elective procedures are concerned, I believe already the British guidelines have started coming about how do you do an elective procedure. A lot of private hospitals in UK out of the NHS network are indeed doing elective work. So it's a matter of resources. So one is that the risk factors which came from China was that if you do elective procedures, the mortality rates are high. But we need to look at more credible evidence-based outcomes. And the way things are changing on a weekly basis, I believe, I am not so pessimistic. I believe within 2 to 3 months, things would be much, much clearer to us. Initially laparoscopy was absolutely ruled out. Now the guidelines are coming forward that it can be done with some protection. So I think this will be a routine. Virus will be there in the society, and we have to work.
I think that's very rightly said. And as Dr. Agarwal was also saying that, this is not something which that virus is going to go away. Virus is going to be part of our life, very much part of our life. We will have to learn to live with it. We will have to change our habits. We'll have to change our social habits and how we conduct ourselves at a workplace. It is going to be a constant dynamic process where, we keep on changing as we will know more and more about the virus.
Yeah, Deep, actually, just one point.
Yeah.
The most of the people who got infected in India, the healthcare workers, got infected from non-COVID patients. So I was talking to an intensivist who is managing COVID patients in Mumbai. I said, how is it for you? He says the COVID ward is the safest ward to work in.
Yeah, because you take all the precautions.
Protection is enough. So if non-COVID patients are being managed with protection, things won't go wrong.
Yeah, that's very well said. So this is for my friend Zamir. So if a patient walks into your emergency room with the features of intestinal obstruction or any other surgical emergency, and there is no history suggestive of that he has come in contact with COVID positive patient, is otherwise asymptomatic, how will you proceed? Will you test him for COVID? And if test comes positive after you have done the surgery, how will you proceed? What will you do? Who will you put into quarantine? And where will you quarantine? I'm sorry, there's a lot of questions into one.
Deep, you have put me in a very, very catch-22 situation, wherein you have asked me a question, he comes with an emergency. So come what may, I need to attend this guy, otherwise my Hippocratic oath will be totally ostracized. And he walks in without any history of contact, and otherwise I'll have to take care whether he has had COVID, and that our front room will take care that whether he has had any symptoms of fever, cold, cough, and any history of contact, or he is some new migrant who has come from abroad, and all these questions later. And when I take him off for surgery, I need to make sure that the theater, everything, and potentially every theater is a trap wherein you have a filter, we don't have a filter, and wherein we have to protect our theater boys, our anesthetists, our right from the housekeeping staff to everyone is involved in this. And once I do the surgery, and then comes your trick question, whether it comes positive after. And now here is the very trick question that I need to quarantine. And quarantine is, of course, the real word comes from the Italian, which says it's 40 days. Quara is 40. But here, if they are asymptomatic and they are all negative, if I have to test everyone, including myself, my theater assistants, my anesthesiologists, all those people whom they have come in contact with, and you want me to run a parallel investigative agency to have trace the contact history and also quarantine all of them, and I need the help of the entire health authorities to take and tackle these issues. And so I will have to quarantine all these people. And you have asked another very pertinent question. So far, we have been discussing only about the respiratory complications of this virus. There are also gastrointestinal complications because we do swallow this virus also. Once they go in, they cause intestinal complications, they have intestinal problems, and we have abdominal griping pain and fever, loose motions, and all these do come in as a multifactorial manifestation of this virus also. So this is a very, very long process, and you wanted me to be precise and concise, and I think I have given you the proper.
Yeah, perfect. Zamir, because it's a very difficult and very pertinent question, I'm going to ask Dr. Raman Goyal to comment on this, and then Dr. K.K. Agarwal. Raman ji.
Yeah. So Deep, as I was mentioning yesterday, only the guidelines have come which were not there. So in this situation where a patient diagnosed positive after the procedure, now the guidelines are very clear, at least in Maharashtra. So it says that if you have come with a situation like this, and all those people who have used PPEs, adequate PPEs, need not be tested, need not to stop working. All right. If you have followed the disinfection protocol after every procedure, like a COVID positive patient, you don't need to shut down that place also. You need to clean that up place with the hypochlorite. Those staff who have not used the PPEs, whether in ward or in any particular area, they need to be quarantined. They need to be quarantined for 7 days. If they become symptomatic in between, then obviously they have to be tested. Otherwise, 7 days later, 7th day, the test has to be done. And if their test comes negative, they should be asked to resume work from the next day. So this quarantine of 14 days for healthcare workers has been shortened to 7 days. And then no hospital should be shut down for more than 24 hours. So this has come yesterday.
That's very crystal clear. And where will you quarantine them? In hospital or housebound?
So it would be preferable to do it in every hospital. Actually, should have a quarantine, because these people at home may infect other family members. So
Right.
they need to be isolated either in a quarantine facility, government quarantine facility, or in the hospital itself.
Let's hear Dr. Agarwal's view on this.
So let me add to what Raman has said. One is, let's go back to Kanika Kapoor. She was positive. She met at least 100 people in the society. She did not infect even a single one. Her viral load was so low that she did not infect others was one possibility. And then we started discussing this case in our CIMAO forum, where all the countries were there. And I asked my Singapore and Hong Kong fellow, what is your protocol of a normal clinic? I'm not talking about even the surgery. He said that if we are wearing all the PEPs, and if our contact time with the patient is less than 30 minutes, we don't take any precautions, number one. Number two, even if we have taken semi-precautions, and if our contact time is less than 30 minutes, we won't close the clinic. But if we were not wearing even if we are wearing a PEP and our time, contact time is more than 30 minutes, then we are concerned about it. We will go for a fumigation of the room for 2 hours. Third thing was, when we discussed about Kanika Kapoor, they said she met everybody less than 3 minutes. So therefore, the contact time, according to India, is 10 minutes. According to Singapore and the Hong Kong is 30 minutes. That means if I meet a person for less than a minute, I'm not likely to get an infection from that person. Remember, in a plane, if a person is tuberculosis sputum positive, a flight of less than 8 hours, my chances of cross-infection is 0. There, the contact time is 8 hours. So therefore, those flights where the flight time is more than 8 hours, then I'm likely to become positive. So in India, within India travel, even if a person is AFB positive, doesn't matter. So therefore, when it comes to guidelines, the new guidelines which we suggest at CIMAO, because remember that we are looking for guidelines from the West or the government guidelines. So we have to create our own guidelines based on the literature. Our CIMAO guidelines is that your say for Sandeep Buddhiraja, his time in the ICU per patient should not be more than 3 minutes. Whether he wants to look after the report, it should be done before, not in front of the patient. So on the patient, your contact time should not be more than 3 minutes. And the rest of the things you can do it in the room on the files. Everything, dictation, everything. Don't ask the patient, sister, which are the reports of yesterday, what testing to be done. That has to be done outside the patient. For a GP, we are saying your contact time should not be more than 5 minutes. Similarly, in surgery, we are recommending not more than 30 minutes per surgeon. Say, for example, if your surgery is 45 minutes, the person is like the person comes, he opens, then the main surgeon comes, and the first person who has opened, he goes away, and then the main surgeon does the main surgery, and then the person who comes forward and he does the closure. So that you have divided your surgical into 3 parts, the initial part, the main part, and the last part, which is what was famous in Vedanta, that there are 3 teams of surgeons, there are 3 teams of anesthetists. The same person is not in contact for more than 30 minutes. So if you really want to plan your surgeries, plan it in such a way that your contact time with the patient, you know that patient is practically negative, but you still don't know, you can't take a chance. So your surgical time should not be more than 30 minutes. And then as far as the residents and all other doctors' duties in a hospital is 7 days. That's a law that you work for 7 days, then 7 days off, then you work for 7 days, 7 days off. 7 days is with the assumption that within 7 days, if you're exposed, you will develop symptoms. I don't think so that will come for surgeons that you operate for 7 days and then you do 7 days, you take it off. That may not happen, but that may be also considered that you do all your surgeries in the month, in the first week, and in the rest 3 weeks, you take 1 day, 1 week off, and 2 weeks you run your OPDs. And that's what Dr. R.P. Gupta used to do. He used to plan all his surgeries from 2 o'clock in the night to 6 o'clock in the morning. And then he used to sleep, and throughout the day, either he's moving around from one hospital to another for doing emergency surgeries, or he was seeing patients. So these types of lessons we have to learn from Asia. You may not get them from the government, and you may not get them from the Western literature. So the Asian literature says that contact time should be less than 5 minutes, if possible 3 minutes, and surgical contact time should be less than 30 minutes per doctor. So you can share up. So if you are having 4 surgeries, you devote every time, in every patient, you devote 20 minutes for the main part. Say you're doing GI anastomosis, you do the anastomosis part, somebody else opens up, somebody else closes up. In any way.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. Thank you very much. So this is a very pertinent question, and a lot of things have come out from this. One is that do not be paranoia. If a patient has come positive and you have taken all the precautions as you would take in a positive patient, then things are not that bad. Reduce your contact time with the patient while in the OPD, while in the rounds, and while during the surgery. Thank you very much. And Zamir is very happy listening to your comments that, you know, every surgeon has to take off after 7 days. Zamir, that's not going to happen.
Sorry, I didn't get a question. Yes, sir.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Just making a comment. So let us look at the Indian healthcare system. There are around 68,000 hospitals in India. Around 40,000 of them have less than 30 beds available, and 3,000 tertiary care hospitals which have more than 100 beds all over the India. And indoor capacity at this point of time has fallen by 70%. OPDs are empty. There are no high-end surgeries going on. There is no medical tourism going on. And the cost of PPEs are very, very steep. They're adding to the cost of the healthcare. And government at this point of time owns around 3,000 crore to the private hospitals in areas. It's a catch-22 situation in a country where a large healthcare system is run by private sector is under attack. And whenever there is a COVID positive patient, government says shut down the hospital. A significant number of patients have been quarantined. So how are we going to survive? Partly this has been answered already, but I would still like a very, very short comment from Dr. Agarwal.
Yes, I agree with you what you are talking, but the scenario is going to change. As I said, number of surgeries will reduce.
Right.
As far as hospitals are concerned, as far as violence is concerned, we have an anti-violence act which has come 2 days back, but with a rider, because that disease epidemic act is only for dangerous diseases. If you define the word, it's a dangerous disease. That means it is specific to COVID. It is not specific to any other disease. And Disease Epidemic Act, if read with Section 269 and 270, we know that it is only connected to COVID. And suppose lockdown is out and you are in a green zone, then in that particular state, say for example in Goa today, there is no epidemic, so therefore practically that act is not available. So that some degree of fear will stay. We are now working at IMA to asking the government to give us immunity during this period for all cases against medical negligence. That means all COVID patients era, we are likely to make mistakes. Not only in COVID patient, even in non-COVID mistakes, we are going to make mistakes. So therefore government should pass a law that during COVID era, till they declare this is as a COVID era, there will be no part of medical negligence. Third thing is that scenario is going to change. Because once you go to a flight, I was talking to an international flight person and they says middle seats will go away and the row before and the row after will go away. That means the plane will not have more than 1/3 of the occupancy. Therefore, charges are going to go high. In the healthcare setting also, with everything together, with maintaining social distancing, I think when the aviation industry is talking about price hike, new prices will come, whether it is during lockdown or after lockdown, everything will become viable again. The prices will go differently. You're not going to compromise on you're not going to do cost cutting to reduce the cost to the patient. And we have seen that cost reduction means you are compromising social distancing. So therefore, it will recorrect, the economy will recorrect by itself in, say, in 1 year's time. The real prices will come. Nobody is going to cut costs in construction, because now what is going to happen is Nightingale wards are going to come up. When you can sit in an economy ward and share a toilet, why can't you share a toilet in a hospital? Why every room should have an attached toilet? Will go away. The AC, central AC will go away in future constructions. You will have big wards. You will have a dirty corridor. You will have a non-dirty corridor. You will have central AC will go out. Only it will be there in the requisite places. So the cost of construction is go down, and your number of people are going to go down. Your cost of treatment will increase, and you will be spending more cost on safety and quality together. So I don't think so. I'm worried about economics. Economics will change, and it will recorrect itself within a year.
Okay, Zamir, since you run a hospital in a smaller place as compared to metros, what is your opinion about this?
The survival of the fittest. And now we have to completely reschedule our OPD programs, make sure that fewer footfalls are there, and make sure that our front line staff are duly protected. And you know, the PPEs are now coming down in prices as of now in Tamil Nadu, whereas we are. And these are all completely stringently done with the PPEs, with the woven fabric that is conforming to the norms of the international standards, right from our facial shield to face visors to our mask, 3-ply masks, to our gloves, to our leg coverings. Everything has been totally now streamlined. And right, since we are also in Rotary, also doing a lot of voluntary work, and we have now been given hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the government is also helping us quite a lot, and we are now working parallel with the government and the government agencies, and we are giving a lot of these PPEs, sanitizers, and all the disinfectants and sanitizers to all the government hospitals also. And we are also now coming up with a lot of ventilators, and on the we are supporting the ICU right down here in Tamil Nadu and also in Kerala, everywhere, right down in South. We are doing quite a lot of work supporting the government hospitals, because they are the one who are right now in the front line taking care of all the people who are isolated and in quarantine and in down with COVID symptoms. But anyway, the COVID positive, we'll have to only think about the positivity of this COVID infection. And the non-COVID also, once the lockdown, we exit from there. We are trying to look at it in a positive way, and let us do it in a minimal style, slowly and of course steadily.
So what I understand is that as we know more and more about the virus, as more and more protocols are coming, and as we are learning from other hospitals, going forward, the shutdowns of the hospital and quarantine is not going to be as strict as it is today. So we'll be allowed to keep working with all the precautions in place. Thank you very much for this lovely answer. So coming to Mr. Mehra, as we are discussing, the cost of the healthcare is going to go up in times to come, as all of the panelists agree with that. So also for non-COVID patients, because we are going to take universal precautions and certain equipments are required, PPEs are required, and they are very expensive. So we assume that the cost for even non-COVID patients for normal routine procedures is going to go up. So how do you react to that?
I think that for the present policies, we have the premium rates based on the past experience. And based on the past experience of the disease rates and all that. So, I think as the cost increases, the insurance cost also increases. The companies will have to think on those terms. Because with the existing rates, we cannot afford the increase. As it is, most of the companies are in the loss, in health, barring few. So, probably the net result will be the insurance will also become costly.
So you are saying the premium of the insurance is also going to go up as the cost is going to go. Yeah, and that sounds...
procedure cost goes high, then the insurance also goes high, because who will bear the loss?
Yes.
Ultimately,
Makes sense.
it is a trust. It is a trust. So we collect money and then distribute money out of it. So if the cost increases, then insurance will go up.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Mehra. So coming to Dr. Chand Wattal. Dr. Wattal, can you tell us, we keep on hearing every day about different companies working on so many vaccines. In your opinion, how far away are we from having an effective vaccine? And does oral polio vaccine has played some role in the immunity, especially in our country?
You see, vaccine is the only thing that probably we all are looking at, and maybe the final thing that may actually help us fight this disease and this scourge. But talking of a vaccine as on today, probably is too premature. There have been more than 60 molecules that are in experiment, and none of them as yet has shown that kind of a promise. Only a couple of molecules are actually in the testing phase, which will still take at least a year to come to the bench. Now, talking of various issues, earlier Dr. KK was also talking about the BCG vaccine, and then Dr. Jacob John was talking of the oral polio vaccine, because that's also an RNA vaccine. So these things are all being extrapolated. We do not have much knowledge as on today. We have to understand all that we are talking of is an imperfect science right now. You talk of all kind of certifications. They give it with a disclaimer as emergency. Even FDA says emergency FDA approval. You talk of publications in reputed journals, NEJMs and others. They are all having actually trying to push in everything so that let people read and decide for themselves. So there is a lot of panic as on today. What is going to finally come up is $1 million question. And of course, it's going to be the vaccine only that's going to see us through. And when it comes, let us see. This is an imperfect science as on today. We do not have a clear-cut evidence that yes, this is going to see us through.
Yeah. So, looking to the news these days, the impression which I get from most of the virologists across the world is that everybody is in a hurry to get out the vaccine. And it is a likely possibility that all processes will be hurried. And by December or January, we will see a vaccine coming out. But as you very rightly said, this is an imperfect science. We don't know. We will have to wait and watch for that. Again, coming to Mehra. Mr. Mehra, is there any provision in insurance policies to reimburse
I want to give a comment.
Hospital quarantine?
See, in the present insurance policies, there is no provision of home quarantine.
Right.
See, normally we pay the claims only on the hospitalization.
Hospitalization.
And hospitalized expenses are only paid.
It may be a good idea for to consider these kind of reimbursements in the future.
Yeah, we will come up. The insurance companies will have to think about it, because then the ratings will be different, and the different policies will come. Fresh policies will be coming after the research based on the available data.
Coming to Neeru. Neeru, since we know that a lot of people are going through socio-psychological trauma, and as our clinicians and physicians are the frontline warrior, they see the patient first, they're the first responder. Would you enable our clinicians, will you tell them some tool how they can basically touch these patients when they come into contact with these patients?
Yeah, so I think it's time for doctors to become the healers that they were in older times.
Absolutely.
So a more holistic approach than we were doing in the recent years, because not everybody is going to have access or the willingness to be able to go to mental health professionals.
Absolutely.
So I would say, 10 years back, the government of India did a drive where they equipped all government doctors with basic knowledge of psychiatry. So I think it is time for all of us to do that, to just refreshen our knowledge, basic knowledge of psychiatry, that what is the symptoms of clinical depression? What is the symptoms of a panic disorder? What is the symptoms of PTSD? So for example, if you get a patient who's had a transient episode of extreme palpitations, redness in the body, sweating, then your differential diagnosis must include a panic attack also. So for that, it will take time to look up and freshen up that knowledge. That's number one. Second, I think the biggest tool is your immediate interaction with the patient, which would have to go away from the classical approach that has been there so far.
Right.
It would now include radical empathy. So rather than giving solutions, which we are all used to doing,
Yeah.
holding that space for that patient to have a cathartic experience where they can vent out their fears and they can do it in a place of psychological safety with you. So I think deep listening in that and having a deep sense of empathy itself will be very, very healing. Then finally, we all know that lifestyle tools for meditation, exercise, positive psychology, mindfulness, which is being talked about so much these days. Mindfulness is something as simple as just being in the moment and relishing each moment. So just guiding and counseling the patient that even if you're drinking a cup of coffee, relish that. Relish your family relationships like what we were talking about earlier. And again, for that, it will need time from the clinicians to, going apart from everything else that we are learning about and getting information about. But sitting down for a few hours to take out the time to learn, it's too short a time for me to say much on this.
Right.
But to be able to actually study those things, they may seem very, very generic, but we do find a definite improvement in the psychological symptoms of patients. When they come up with saying that I'm seeing a dark hole in my solar plexus, or I'm having this extreme palpitations, or I'm having tears, I can't explain my tears, And when you make them go through a regime of exercising, guided meditation is available online for so many people these days.
Right.
I have one of my own and I'm very happy to share it with the group,
That's very
And
nice.
there are such things, I think, which if there is I think patients are going through, people are going through a time when they are having to make micro decisions all the time, as far as the schedule of the day is concerned. What should I do now? Because there's no overseeing authority. So what should I do now? What should I do next? And I'm guiding people to have calendars even for personal things like exercising and meditation. And that's greatly, greatly helpful. Then another thing which we have to be very mindful of is what we call the diverse groups, people who have some special circumstances. For example, people with disabilities or people who belong to the LGBTQ group or the elderly, like we've been talking about. Now, these people will definitely need a bit more attention than the others. So we are actually doing a research on people with disabilities and what they are facing. They are not able to go to their healthcare providers where they need basic mobility apparatus. They're not able to do that. That definitely is going to impact their psyche. Also, their sense of identity may have been driven by their work, which is no longer there. So all those things will need a little more attention. And last but not the least, knowing when to refer to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And you may have to take an extra effort to coax them into it, because people in India are not really too happy about going. Even educated people think of it as an attack.
I would agree with that.
Yes, I go to social occasions and I know people there and they refuse to say hello to me because they don't want other people to know that they're a psychiatrist.
So what you are saying that from being a clinician only, we need to change ourselves into a more holistic person.
Absolutely.
Healing the patient. And there are multiple parts to that. You first have to have an empathy. You have to have a compassion. You must have patience to listen to their problem, and then possibly offering a solution. And most of the times, I think a huge percentage of patients will be satisfied with these things, and then we identify patients who will need to be referred to a specialist.
Yes, absolutely. The word psychological safety, if you provide that psychological safety, I think that's very healing by itself.
Right. Zamir, you're raising your hand. Please go ahead. Quickly. You need to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Zamir.
I would like to add to what Niru has said. The very word that you have COVID positive means now you are stigmatized. Now this is social stigma, right? In health workers, paramedical workers, and any patient, the community looks at you with a different outlook. So I think that also need to be now ostracized. I think we'll have to take out that social stigma, which is
lovely
in these days.
Thanks, Amir. Yeah. So as you were talking about the economic losses, so we saw the bloodbath at the stock exchange, and there are job losses. Believe me, I was looking at the history of pandemics. None of the pandemics has caused so many job losses. The life losses have been more in other pandemics, but here we are talking about, at this point of time, 22 million job losses till now, and it is not going to stop. And in these times, we are still talking about pay cuts for doctors. The frontline warriors are being asked to, have pay cuts. Well, if you look from the point of view of the hospital owners, maybe they are right. But if you look from the point of view of frontline warriors, you are at risk. You are present in front of the problem all the time, and you still are not being paid. Zamir, your views on that?
Well, I'm a hospital owner and I'm an individual consultant. And we have now learned to live with essentials. And so far, we have been living with non-essentials also. Once we cut off this, I think the pay cut, as in a conformity with the economy, we need to have definitely a pay cut. But that means we need to go back to those old days when we used to see our senior professors who are wearing only white and white coming in their bicycles. So we need to go back to those days.
Minimalistic life.
Absolutely. Yes. Thanks.
Dr. Sandeep Buddhiraja, would you like to comment on this?
I think he has left.
He's left. Okay. Okay, then we'll come to another question. Again, he's left. So we will ask Dr. KK Agarwal or anybody else. So 50 to 70% of cases are asymptomatic. Should we not test all healthcare workers and nurses to make sure that they are not the carriers as a first line, rather than testing the community? Why not test the healthcare workers? Dr. Agarwal, sir.
This discussion was held in one of the WHO international meeting where two hospitals owner, a Italian doctor talked about it, and they said our protocol is to test every week. All healthcare workers are tested every week. And they found 50 were positive, out of which only 5 were symptomatic. 45 of them were asymptomatic. And that is what a standard protocol now has become, is you do a week's meeting, go back, come back after 7 days, get your test done. If it is negative, join. If it is positive, go back for a quarantine for another 1 week. So therefore, testing, sense, yeah. but at the moment, we don't have so much testing. We say that China today is unreliable. All the antibodies test has come from China. They are unreliable. They're going to damage more than doing the test as on today. So you go back on your clinical sites and look for unusual features. Today we say in the COVID era, anything which is unusual, anything which you cannot explain, anything appearing for the first time, maybe a rash, maybe a loss of smell, maybe a loss of taste, maybe a headache, maybe just feeling weakness, maybe a sign of COVID. Don't only look for breathlessness, cough and fever.
So as a principle, you would agree that this principle is sound, that healthcare workers should be tested, but at this point of time, because of lack of facilities, we are not doing it.
I just want to add is that people have been waiting for vaccine. Don't wait for the vaccine, only wait for a good drug. The reason being, even today, after 9 years of H1N1, we still don't have a vaccine in our national program. We still don't have a vaccine being given by all our hospitals to their staff. People have to buy, we can't afford. And this vaccine in corona, the WHO says coronaviruses do not give you immunity for more than a year. So therefore, it will come back something like a vaccine, which is every year, which people will not afford. China first corrected its economy after their lockdown. Now they're selling things 4 times the cost. They've corrected their economy. Now US has gone through a lot of economy loss. So they are in hurry of making a vaccine so that they can come back and recover their economy. Therefore, yes. Vaccine is not going to be cheap.
So Dr. Agarwal, another tricky question for you. What legal issues do you expect during this period? We know that in pandemic, under Pandemic Act, doctors cannot be sued. But are there?
No, that is not correct. Doctors cannot be sued unless that is the policy makers cannot be sued. Therefore, we are asking government to come back with an ordinance that during this period, the decision taken by all the doctors cannot be sued. As on today, they can be. As on today, I'm aware a lot of people are asking for files after the death. I'm aware that even teleconsultation, if you see the new law, it has a provision which mentions that your license can be erased forever, cancelled. They say, that means your violation of anything during this act, even Telemedicine Act is not giving you protection from COVID. So therefore, it's a tricky situation. Take consent. Then if you're doing a telemedicine, never call yourself, never initiate a call. Let the patient initiate a call. Because if the patient is initiating a call, implied consent and consent is implied. If you are calling a patient tomorrow will say, I never asked for a consultation. He forced me for a consultation. So lots of legal issues are there in this particular issue. I can't enumerate them in 2 minutes, but there was people who said that after this COVID era, means when it becomes a pandemic to endemic, there will be two people who are going to have a new epidemic, and that will be a mental illness that is called coranxiety. And second thing, it will be the lawyers who will be boomed up with cases and earning money out of it.
Perfect, lovely. So also, so two important things can come out. One, that if you're doing a telemedicine, don't call your patient, let them call you. And the second, if you're doing any procedure during this time and after this, a COVID consent is necessary. That's very important for all of us. So coming back to Mr. Mehra.
COVID consent doesn't prevent you because we don't have the validity of a COVID consent. So therefore, because we still don't know what COVID consent is, so therefore it is always better that if you are taking a COVID consent, record it, you audio recorded, video recorded, and get it signed by multiple people in the family, not one.
Okay. So what I meant was not a generalized COVID consent, but a procedure-specific COVID consent.
You will require in every patient. Why? Because tomorrow, if you pass on an infection to other as a healthcare worker, he will sue you that you never told me that you haven't got tested in the last 7 days.
So this, I believe this is a separate topic for a webinar.
Yes.
Legal issues. So we will stop here. So coming to Mr. Mehra. Mr. Mehra, how technology is supporting you in settling the
Can
claim?
I sign off? It's 90.
Sir, wait for another 5 minutes, then you can go.
Okay.
Just 5 minutes.
Okay.
Mr. Mehra, so as you were saying that offices are shut, you're working from home. Is technology enabling you to settle the claims and processing the claims?
Yes, Doctor. Without technology, it was very difficult because our offices are closed. They are 100% closed, and we are all working from home. So, with the help of the technology, we are able to service. We are able to give the cashless. And without technology, it would have been very, very difficult.
So this is one area where technology is again helping us.
Yes. I can't imagine working from home and giving cashless to the hospitals in time, because manually it takes a lot of time. Any person who knows the claim, who knows the policy conditions, who knows the procedures, then cost of the procedures, manually it will take time. One single case can take 2 months, 2 hours.
So you have partly answered this next question, which is the challenges and long-term preparedness of insurance companies. If you would like to summarize in a couple of lines.
So we will have to focus on technology. We'll have to prepare ourselves for handling more number of the claims in lesser time. And
increase the EMIs for the insurance.
EMIs, I'm sorry, EMIs rates, you mean?
Yeah, rates. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
See, premium rates will depend on the experience, claim experience. It may not be adverse. If it is not adverse, the rating will not change. If it is adverse, if the losses are more, then the rates will change. That will depend on that. And considering this present experience, because we have to close down all the offices, so we will have to depend more on the technology. And we'll have to make technology, we'll have to have a platform where everybody can work from home. And it has been a very good experience. At least our company is able to work from home. People are, delivering very well. They are doing much better than perhaps from the office.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mehra. Thank you very much. So I would request Dr. Chand Vatal, sir, is Sir Ganga Ram Hospital involved in some research or some trials from which we can learn in near future?
We are trying actually to get into some data that we can actually generate on BCG. Right. So, but it's at a very, very rudimentary stage as on today. And we're also trying to put our protocol, since we are having a COVID hospital, where we may try and get in the plasma infusions. That's number 2. And then we're also trying to get into some multi-centric where we could enroll people with different kind of therapies, as Dr. Buddhiraja was trying to say to begin with. as to what is really working and what not working in our conditions. So these are some very limited kind of
Right.
thought processes going on as on today. Let us,
Unfortunately, Sandeep has left. I was speaking to him, and they are also initiating a lot of protocols because their hospital also being a COVID hospital. So
Yes.
lot of data they are recording and a lot of randomization they are doing. So let's see what comes out of these.
yes, yes.
Professor Kavi Arya, so we were talking about mathematical modeling, artificial intelligence, and data science. Would you elaborate a little bit on mathematical modeling?
I'll just be very brief here. I've been seeing a lot of these mathematical models and predictions and stuff like that. I think India happens to be within its predictions because there's a natural immunity or something that is that's protecting our population more than others, as was noticed before. I don't know whether it's the age of the population, which is the average age is less than 25, or is it our health practices where hygiene is built into our civilizational mores? You leave your chappals at the entrance of the house. I mean, you kind of normally hygiene is included. You do namaste instead of handshakes, all
Right.
these kind of things. But most of the mathematical models work by totally simplifying the view of the world. Like, for instance, you look at a box containing lots of dots, which are individuals, and model how the dots will spread to the individuals in a very stochastic way. But the real world is not like that. You actually have a box with different compartments where people who are in the middle class can social distance. Then you have other compartments like Dharavi and slums like that, where social distancing is not possible.
Right.
So it's very difficult to model these kind of scenarios. And then how do you model migrants moving around at long distances? How do you model? You have a contained zone, and apparently even if you have a small breach in the containment zone and even one or two individuals going in and out, it can totally ruin the model, and you can
Right.
things become unpredictable. So I feel that models can be used to inform policy, but they cannot be used as a full basis of a policy.
Right. Thank you very much. That's very informative, Professor Arya. Niru, coming to you, we were talking about PTSD post-COVID. We just talked about how we are going to deal them now, but what do you foresee in the future?
So for that, let me just give you a very, very quick model of how PTSD occurs. So there is a conscious mind and there is an unconscious mind. And the unconscious mind is believed to be far larger than the conscious mind. And there is a critical mind in between. When the conscious mind is overloaded with message units, so for example, if there is a trauma, the critical gate opens up and whatever is there happening at that time gets programmed into the unconscious mind, leading to flashbacks. So the main thing about PTSD is flashbacks. So once the trauma is over, the patient will have the flashbacks of the time of the trauma because at that time it was programmed into the unconscious mind. So the trick is the prevention. The trick is that in these times, what we were talking about earlier, how do we ensure that the trauma which is being programmed into the unconscious mind, the impact is less at that time? So rather than treating it with all the medical treatment later, it is critical and vital for us to right now having a positive state of mind and a lot of support system available for the patient so that it does not program into the unconscious mind, which comes back at flashbacks later on. So
Right.
if it is managed psychologically well at this time, that will be far less traumatic and far less morbidity than treating it later on. So therefore, again, like I was saying, the access to healthcare professionals and to mental health professionals is going to be very critical. Probably the costs will have to be reduced. Probably the government will have to ensure that each medical unit has enough number of mental health professionals available so that PTSD does not occur later on.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Niru. Thank you very much. Dr. Raman, so I think we have already discussed this question, but you can, very briefly tell us, when will we start routine surgeries?
I think, Deep, very soon.
Very soon.
Obviously, everything will not start. So we'll have to try the surgeries and decide which are urgent ones and which will start, then semi-urgent ones will start. So I think it's a gradual process, but already there are discussions happening, guidelines have started coming. So I believe somewhere about 2 to 3 months from now would be a realistic number of months that we should be looking at the start of elective procedures.
You're saying 2 to 3 months from now?
Yeah.
Acha, no, I was very optimistic because some of us have already started doing it. But yes, as you said, that we are not going full blown. We are slowly doing procedures now. And we will obviously learn on the way and also see, get feedback from others, what is happening as we are learning.
My concern is the lockdown. The lockdown is delaying the as I said initially, the peak of viral cases. So this is not going to go down. Number of cases not going to go down, and the resource crunch will only increase with time. If these people in the power are taking care of the resources now, they're building it up, then we should start elective. Otherwise, this.
So you're saying logistically it may take a little time, but mentally and principally now we are sort of ready to start slowly. Okay. So
I can't hear
it's
you.
a very nice quote I found. History began when humans invented gods, and it will end when humans become gods. So our history is around 70,000 years old. And there were 6 species of human beings at that point of time. Homo sapiens, we seem to be very smart and the most powerful. That is how we have survived, and rest of them have vanished. And with the help of technology, which we keep on inventing every other day, and we want to become gods, so we believe. But still we believe that God decided to put us under repair, and till we become God, this is what we have to see. I am very sure that we will come out winner out of it together, all of us. But life is going to be different. We will have to press a reset button on every aspect in our life, whether it is relationships, whether it is socializing, whether it is economy, whether it is a minimalistic living, whether it is our profession. Everybody will have to press a reset button and do that. I would like to leave you with this important thought at the moment, and I'm going to invite Dr. Raman Goyal to give a small presentation, which he has here, and then we will come back to answer questions from the audience. Dr. Raman Goyal, please.
Yeah, Deep, thank you. So primarily, we did a survey recently, and I'm going to show the results of the survey. This was a Pan India survey among our members. And thank you to all those who participated. A brief word about these webinars. We started very early. This was somewhere about 3rd of April. The first webinar was held. That's almost a month, and we are stopping this series of webinars coming week. So the last webinar will be on bariatric, and we went in an order that we order of commonality. Next slide, please. Yeah, and we, besides being an academic organization, once COVID hit, we suddenly turned ourselves into a service organization for our physicians. And our members have a reach. We have over 8,000 members. So members have reach in all over the country, in every hospital. And as you see, Dr. Zamir Pasha, who is also a panelist today, our trustee, helped people in Trichy. And this is on behalf of IAGS. And Dr. Satpriyo Desarkar in Kolkata. Next slide, please. And then Dr. Ishwar Murthy, who is our secretary in Erode, and Dr. Tangavelu's both father and son in Coimbatore. Next. And Dr. Jaideep Palep in Nair Hospital and Sion Hospital in Mumbai, and also in Kasturba Hospital in Mumbai. And Dr. Jaya Maheshwari at SMS Hospital in Jaipur. So the IAGS purchased all these PPEs and donated in different hospitals. And this is the task force which meets frequently through Zoom meeting and decides, prioritizes who will get the PPEs based on the requirement. And I'm very happy to share that Rotary Club through Dr. Zamir and Dr. Deep are going to participate. We also found a scientific committee to look after them. IAGS came out with surgical practice guidelines, which was the first laparoscopic association in the country. And then we have also come out with an IAGS endoscopic practice recommendations. Next. And then what happened, this is the first time the 3 minimal access surgery associations, IAGS, AMASI, and CELSI, came together to form inter-association surgical practice guidelines, which have been circulated. Next. Then we did this survey. This was a recent, about 5 days back. We circulated a monkey survey form to the members to assess their pre-COVID surgical practice, post-lockdown practice, and what measures they believe should be taken, and what are their concerns. So we got responses from 152 surgeons. 90% of them are men, and we also asked for their experience. 40% have more than 20 years of surgical experience, and another 35%. So they are all experienced surgeons. 30% are full-timers, and 37% go to multiple hospitals. Next, yeah. So we asked them what were the majority of their cases before surgery, and they said that almost 40% of them do laparoscopic procedures, and about 16-17% are open surgeries, but the equal proportion of rest of them. So I think laparoscopy is a major component in their practice, because this association is of laparoscopic surgery. And prior to lockdown, they were seeing on an average about 25-27 patients a day in OPD, and on a monthly basis they were doing about 42 surgeries, and average monthly emergency surgeries were about 10. And now after the lockdown, their outpatient surgeries are completely cancelled in about 38% patient surgeons, and about 60% have scaled down their OPD, and there is no surgeon who is still doing OPD as usual. And then what has happened is that about the surgeries. So look at this. This is phenomenal. About 92% of them have cancelled all their elective cases. And this is in line with what Deep was saying earlier, that it has affected them financially. And there are very few people who are doing very few elective cases, and there are extremely few who are saying no elective cases are cancelled. Has COVID-19 affected your emergency surgical practice? So there are very few, about 10% of them saying that they are rejecting all emergency cases. So contrary to popular perception that doctors are not taking cases, or they are not coming to hospitals, this shows that they are doing emergency cases. 40% of them are doing few, and a major component, almost 48% of them, are saying that we are not rejecting any of the cases. Now, this is again interesting, because Dr. K.K. Agrawal said that he does take HCQ. I also take HCQ on a regular basis. And this survey shows about 42 to 43% of the surgeons are on HCQ, and some of them are, very few of them have taken azithromycin. And how do you plan to continue surgery in future based on current available information? And it's very encouraging to know that almost 70% of the surgeons are saying we will wait for more information or COVID-related information to come. So I think that's very important, that people are looking forward to research supporting their practice in future, and this is how it is going to be. Next slide, if there's any. Yeah, so thank you so much for giving this opportunity. Thanks to all the panelists and Deep for a wonderful program.
Thank you very much. So most of the questions which I have received have almost been answered. There's one question which somebody wants to ask Mr. Mehra, that in GIPSA packages, say for gallbladder surgery today, if we do a surgery now and it's almost in a good hospital, around 40,000 rupees be extra charged. Is GIPSA going to cover that in the package? Because these costs of PPEs and air seal, which are absolutely necessary to be used in these surgeries. Is Mr. Mehra there?
I am here, doctor.
Mr. Mehra, please.
Yes, I have heard it. So presently, all the procedure rates are in GIPSA. We have these are the negotiated rates.
Right.
But over and above, for this COVID, all the PPE and all these equipment, so a reasonable cost is also considered in addition to the procedures negotiated. but they are reasonable. I mean, they cannot be beyond.
Right.
So a reasonable cost is being considered. It is not that it is excluded.
It's not. Another question is for Dr. Chand Wattle, where they're asking that pathologists, when they are working in their labs, what precautions do they take?
Well, pathologists, particularly cytopathologists who are actually running and centrifuging samples, need to be careful. As far as my colleagues, microbiologists, they need to be careful with the respiratory samples, as well as the centrifugations that we very frequently do. So they need to be cautious in that, try and utilize the biosafety cabinet as much as possible. And when you either try and put the centrifuge in the biosafety cabinet, if not, the lid is closed. When you open, you should be with N95 mask. And if you are on the bench without any precaution of a biosafety cabinet, then use a mask while inoculating samples. That is, and then sanitize yourself very frequently with at least 0.1% sodium hypochlorite very frequently. That should see them through.
Thank you. Before I say thanks to all the panelists, if anybody wants to make a comment, please go ahead and do so. Yeah, Zamir, please. Your voice is not audible, Zamir. Yeah, now it's okay.
Thank you, Deep, for that wonderful. You have comprehensively covered the entire thing, both the health crisis and the economic crisis. Thank you very much for that wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. It was a pleasure and honor having you here. I hope the audience enjoyed how we looked at the multiple things related to COVID. And I once again thank all the panelists. Thank you very much. Stay safe. We are under repair. So enjoy this period positively with your family and friends. Thank you very much. God bless you. Stay safe.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Very good.